So with this particular talk, I'm not doing any demonstrations, and I'm not actually doing, it's not as technical. So we're going to cover off some basics. I assume that most people here have seen some containers or Kubernetes or talks. Would that be fair? Has anybody not seen anything at all? Don't be shy. Put up your hand. It's quite all right. Okay. So as I said, I'm not going to focus on that. But as I said, what we're going to try to do is talk a little bit more about whether you should be moving your production SQL Server workloads to containers. So we'll talk about this in more detail in a short while. So yeah, the usual things that you're used to now. So please silence your phones, explore everything PASS has to offer, etc., etc. So I'm based in Australia. I do a lot of work all over the place, but all over the world, but based in Sydney in Australia. And I've been doing SQL Server for a long time. I've always been more interested in infrastructure and upgrades. So you do the usual things with BI and optimization and troubleshooting and things like that. But I do a lot of stuff where I go into organizations and upgrade their entire SQL Server infrastructure. So put down standards around that, deploy SQL Server in a different way so the organization's a lot more agile, they can upgrade, manage it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in an interesting space in the industry because this whole containers, Kubernetes, et cetera, that Microsoft have been championing and SQL Server on Linux, et cetera, is an interesting inflection point, I think, in the industry. So going forward, what are we going to do with SQL Server? And I see that in other parts of Microsoft stack as well, be it BI, whatever, but I think this is our turn in the infrastructure side of things. So Microsoft's sort of moving more into SQL Server on containers, and do we go along with that ride? So this talk is going to be a little bit more tactical, strategic business than actually technology itself there. And maybe not answer all of the questions, but certainly hopefully highlight some of the more important questions that you should be asking. So management next Monday are going to come in and say, look, should we be using SQL Server in Kubernetes or on containers or OpenShift? Should we be doing that? You've just gone to the PASS Summit. You're now the de facto experts on all of this inside the organization. What are we going to do for the next 5-10 years? So hopefully this presentation will allow you to have a conversation on Monday over the weekend with some of the questions and thoughts and where we're going to head. Hopefully you understand what I'm saying. So, I come to Seattle about, 4 times a year, and Australians speak English, Americans speak English, but sometimes there's just I don't know what's going on. I was flying up here and on the plane, obviously, and the person in the middle comes across and said, do you want donuts or Jesus? I'm like, what, donuts or Jesus? And what, Jesus? Yeah, Jesus. And everybody's ears have perked up now. And it's like, Jesus, what? Jesus? I don't like donuts, and I don't particularly, well, I can't say I like, let's go there, but I'm not interested in Jesus on a plane either. Does anybody know, or anybody like to hazard a guess as what she was asking me? Cheez-Its. So I've never heard of Cheez-Its. So again, it was like, oh, Jesus. What are we talking about Jesus for? I was like, oh, Cheez-Its. Oh, okay. All right, so. Anyway, so hopefully you understand what I'm saying, and hopefully I'll understand any questions that you have. Scream them out. So if you scream out any questions, you get an amazing sticker. So these are really highly sought after, in-demand stickers. Okay, so any questions? We'll see how we go. If we sort of get stuck for time, we'll stop questions. But as I said, I'm encouraging people to participate. So I do like interactive sessions there. So when I actually submitted this particular session to PASS, I wasn't, this was all relatively new. So SQL Server hadn't been released in terms of 2019. The messaging wasn't there potentially from Microsoft. So as you can see, I sort of put in an abstract with the title was asking about whether you should move your production workloads to SQL Server, and that's important because we're not talking about non-production, CI/CD, DevOps, etc. We're not going down that particular space. We're focusing solely on production environments, and that sort of implies that you are already running production workloads on SQL Server. So should you be moving them to containers, these sorts of things like that? And again, you can see with the particular abstract, I've said, you might get the impression that they've abandoned the Windows operating system. So, we were talking about containers, Linux, we're talking about Kubernetes, and again, does that sort of mean that Microsoft is going to go away from Windows and not support that and these sorts of things? So that was quite an interesting thought experiment of mine of where we're going to head in the future. So what we're going to do, as I said, inside this particular talk is examine some of these issues, whether you should be using containers for your production workloads and those sorts of things there. So as I said, we're not going to go through mechanics and demonstrations because I assume that you're already aware of that to some degree and been going to some of the sessions, but I do want to concentrate more on the tactical and strategic side of things and whether you should be going down this particular path there. So again, we'll just start off with an introduction, just to get a quick high-level talk about containers at an architectural level, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, and then talk about the potential challenges, concerns, risks, and choose your own adventure, as I call it, towards the end there, sort of. Does anybody remember those books a long time ago, those choose your own adventure books? Yeah. So again, it's up to you. And hopefully you understand why we're talking about that towards the end of this particular session. But as I said, I want to focus more on the second half of the session, which is looking about the potential and what you could be doing with SQL Server and how you deploy that inside your organizations going forward in the next decade plus, as the case might be. So obviously, from a strategic point of view, it's good for you to align your SQL Server strategy with what Microsoft's doing as well. So again, there's a nice crossover then with Microsoft putting features into the product. And if you're going down the same path, you'll be able to leverage and get a good ROI on those particular features as they get released inside SQL Server. So let's start off with a little bit of an introduction. And what I thought I'd do is just ask a couple of questions. So maybe, as I said, put up your hands, hopefully, please. We're not remembering who's answered what questions, but let's have a look at these questions and see what kind of a response we get from people. So how many people have played around with containers? Okay, so what, that's about a third of people? How many people have played around with containers where they've started to customize things through Docker files, so they've gone to that level as opposed to spinning up? Okay, so maybe half of those original people. Okay. How many people have played around with Kubernetes? Okay, only maybe 5, 6 hands. Okay. And again, this conference has been very much about Microsoft promoting or talking about Kubernetes, I should say, the internals of it, how SQL Server works with it, with Bob's sessions and the other people's sessions as well there. Okay. Okay, as I said, that's pretty much what I expected. So I think, it's relatively new to everyone, and we're all sort of in the same boat. Now let's go back more to SQL Server and what you potentially have been doing. How many people have developed a standard build or a standard operating environment for SQL Server? Okay, that's actually quite good, so that's maybe about 40% of people. Okay. How many people have defined different tiers for SQL Server? So you might have a gold, platinum, bronze, sapphire, diamond, whatever, tier 1, 2, 3, and then you deploy applications on those. So a few people as well. Okay, that's good. That's about 30 to 40% of the people. How many people have deployed SQL Server and Windows Server Core? Are you being honest? That's actually quite a higher number than I expected. All right, so again, there's a few people there. Okay, because as I said, in my world, in Australia, nobody wants to deploy SQL Server and Windows Server Core, and there's a lot of resistance against that, and I don't quite understand why. But again, that's not a very popular combination there. For those of you that are deploying SQL Server on Windows Server Core, do you do it solely on Windows Server Core or only some of the tiers? Some of the SQL Server instances. Who's doing it solely on Windows Server Core? Okay, all right, so good show of hands. Okay. How many people are deploying, managing, controlling SQL Server through PowerShell as opposed to graphical interfaces? How many people are using graphical interfaces? Okay, so there's a good number on PowerShell or scripting. Okay, fantastic. And where else? How many people have decoupled SQL Server storage? So what I'm saying is you might be running SQL Server in VMs or in bare metal, etc., but you're running SQL Server, wait for you might put your hand down, off shares, SMB3 shares. So I mean decoupled it that way. So not decoupling the storage by having a VDMK or RDM device or something like that, or hyperconverged, but actually decoupled SQL Server so that SQL Server's database files are sitting on an SMB share on a scale-out file server or something like that. Okay, so nobody's done that? Okay, so that's what I meant by decoupled in that particular case there. Okay. And how many people have done things with SQL Server where you either spin up SQL Server quickly through cloning technology or sys prepping it or imaging it or something like that? Okay, all right, so less people, but again, I'm sort of getting you to think about a particular space because this is what we should be possibly heading towards when we're going to potentially be deploying SQL Server in containers and Kubernetes and those sorts of things there. So that's actually quite a good representation because, as I said, in other parts of the world that I've worked in, people would not have done that as much as the hands that I saw going up there. Okay, so another question, is this session promoting you to move your SQL Server production workloads to containers, or is this session promoting keeping your SQL Server production workloads on containers? So who thinks it's the first? One person, two people, 3, 4, 5, 6? How many people think it's the latter? Okay, about the same. Okay. The rest of them are indifferent. I'll remember that next time as an option inside the thing. Okay. Well, the answer is neither. Okay. It's all about choice. So the idea here is I don't expect people to all of a sudden, when they upgrade potentially to the next version of SQL Server, to migrate everything across to containers and Kubernetes as the case might be. And at the same time, I don't expect people and promoting people to stay on the Windows platform, etc. So it's all about choice. And I think that's interesting because from a Microsoft messaging point of view, I'm not sure whether that's clear. Because you go to a conference and everything's on Kubernetes and containers and you're scratching your head thinking, well, does that mean they're sort of abandoning the Windows operating system? We're abandoning Windows failover clustering because you should be using Kubernetes instead and availability groups inside Kubernetes and those sorts of things like that. And that's actually not true. So for Microsoft, I think it's all about choice. So again, we've been running SQL Server on the Windows operating system on the Wintel architecture for quite a long time. So there's experience there, there's standards there, so we should still be able to leverage that, and that will continue. But the interesting thing, of course, for the past summit is that people haven't been running SQL Server on Linux. We're not Linux shops in general because you didn't have that option before. So maybe some of these talks of running SQL Server on Linux should be at a Linux conference as opposed to a past summit conference. So again, a lot of people at the past summit are coming up and asking, well, should we be going to Linux? What's the advantage of doing that? Is there licensing benefits, performance benefits, these sorts of things like that? And hopefully what we're going to focus on is these sorts of questions inside this particular session there. So as I said, it's completely up to you, but hopefully as a result of this session and other sessions and some research, etc., you're going to make a more informed decision as to how you're going to deploy SQL Server going forward strategically for 5, 10 years inside your organization. So you can go all in, or you can have a hybrid or a transactional strategy as well, and that's what I really wanted to focus on. But at the end of the day, hopefully what we're going to do is get you to redeploy SQL Server better inside your organization there. So how many people are running like hundreds of SQL servers and thousands of databases? Okay, that's a good swag of people over here, a good percentage of people. So again, what we're trying to do is make your life easier and have better outcomes for your organization. And the more you standardize and deploy SQL Server in a controlled fashion, the better off you're going to be. So I always think of an upgrade opportunity as a really good opportunity of getting your shop right, redeveloping standards, going forward, refactoring your SQL Server environments. But now you have the option of redeploying SQL Server on containers, Kubernetes, let's say, as opposed to staying with Windows and VMware and Nutanix and Hyper-V, of course, and those sorts of products as well. So, before I was flying out to this particular conference, a friend of mine, because I'm in Australia, said, "Oh, Victor, do you want to go down to the beach and swim with sharks and wrestle some crocodiles and do some surfing?" Because that's what we all do in Australia. I keep going to ask questions about snakes and spiders and sharks and these sorts of things. And I sort of replied, no, sorry, I can't wrestle with crocodiles and swim with sharks and eat spiders and snakes because I'm going to the past summit, so I'm going to be talking about whether you should be running SQL Server in containers, etc. And I'm actually not quite sure as to what my message is going to be. Am I going to be pro or con? So I've been thinking about that, etc. And he sort of replied with this sort of SMS saying, oh, it's hard because it's a new technology, but things are going to change. Windows users are not used to writing text files much. That's the problem. So I thought that was relatively insulting, but I thought, okay, Stan, I'm going to quote you at the past summit. But also, in a way, that's why I asked the question of how many people are deploying and managing SQL Server through PowerShell and scripts and those sorts of things, as opposed to traditionally we haven't done that because the Windows ecosystem has always been more graphical interfaces as opposed to managing infrastructure through files, different markup languages and those sorts of things like that. Whereas the Linux world and other places have been doing that with quite a while. So we also have to make that transitional change and understand Docker files and YAML files and whether we should be doing things in Bash or PowerShell, etc., etc., etc. So again, it's going to be difficult for us because we traditionally haven't been doing this, and we've got best practices around how to do things in Windows and SQL and these sorts of things. So what I always like to do with these sorts of sessions is give you a little bit of a history lesson here to have a look at what's been happening with SQL Server and talk about industry trends. So again, you can see I've sort of put up things that are recent in historical things inside SQL Server. So you can see that I've put some things in brackets. I hope this is all correct. But you have had the capability of running SQL Server off shares, as you can see with 2008 R2 and 2012. So we don't have to have direct attached storage. We don't have to have hyperconverged storage. We can actually have a completely separate storage layer. We create shares on top of that, and SQL Server system and user databases can now access and run off shares. So again, that was the question about whether we've gone down this path of decoupling SQL Server Engine from the storage layer completely like that there. There's been a capability in the product for quite a while, and you could implement it on scale-out file server, so there's no outage on the file server storage. So again, there'll be no downtime as a result of you having to patch the Windows Server, scale-out file server, and those sorts of things. But I just don't see people using that capability inside the product as well there. You can see SQL Server 2012 onwards has supported Windows Server Core. But again, I get a lot of resistance to people wanting to go to Windows Server Core. And when you think about it, that's sort of a parallel to what we're doing with containers. So a container is sort of like the bare OS or something on which to run SQL Server. But we've sort of been resisting doing that, even though we're telling people there are benefits of running SQL Server on Windows Server Core. So patching, security, smaller footprint, higher virtualization densities, etc. So again, we're sort of maybe uncomfortable with doing things inside containers because we're uncomfortable with doing it on Windows Server Core. And you can see in the last couple of years, Microsoft have released SQL Server 2017, supported Linux, supported containers, and sort of evolving now in 2019 into the big data cluster space. So again, just to get a show of hands, how many people have leveraged these advancements? Some of them at least? Yeah, okay, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just getting you to think about these sorts of things. How many people are interested in big data clusters? Think it's possibly for them? Okay. So again, just wanted to highlight that particular component because Microsoft have really bet big on this particular components of SQL Server 2019. So you've got all sorts of other peripheral technology that has been released, intelligent query processing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the signature dish, the big ticket item in this particular case is SQL Server 2019 is big data clusters. So again, hopefully you've gone to these particular sessions, and when you think about it, Microsoft haven't really done a lot of work with SQL Server in a way. They've integrated the SQL Server database engine with Spark, so yeah, sure, that's SQL Server, but otherwise, what have they been doing for the last 2-3 years? Not that I know. They've been working more on the control plane and getting it to work with all of the different bits and pieces because there's a lot going on inside a big data cluster, okay? And the important thing for them is to make it as easy as possible for you to configure, manage, control, deploy, these sorts of things, because if it's too difficult, you're not going to go down that particular path. And then there'll be, some internal discussions at Microsoft, I expect, with why have we not seen a good adoption of big data clusters? We really bet big on this particular technology. So again, really trying to reduce that friction and hopefully exciting you about the potential use of this particular technology and where it will go in the next release of SQL Server as well. Okay? But again, Microsoft, so you're sort of getting the impression that Microsoft is all about running SQL Server on Kubernetes, Kubernetes, Kubernetes. You're hearing that all the time. So before we're sort of, we support Linux, we support containers, we've got Docker, we've got Portainer, those sorts of things. But the message, I think, in the last 12 months has been about Kubernetes, these sorts of things there. So tactically and strategically, that should be, raising some flags within your organization. And the next slide is talking about some of these industry trends. So again, I'm not going to go through them at length, but we've had Docker come along for quite a long time. Container adoption has been quite big in the industry. Maybe not in our world, but again, in the IT industry as we go to cloud solutions and these sorts of things like that. Again, a couple of years ago, Microsoft was really promoting using SQL Server and Linux containers and DevOps, CI/CD pipelines, and those sorts of things like that. So maybe it wasn't production ready, or Microsoft recognized that people aren't going to go to that. They've a bit of work to do internally. But you can see, as I said, in 2019, they're really pushing this. Consider starting to use SQL Server in containers. But we need to have a good story with benefits and those sorts of things, to what are the benefits of us doing things differently in a particular way because we have that rich history of how we've been managing SQL Server inside our organization. So a very, very important piece, and probably one of the more important pieces in this particular slide deck, and in the context of this particular talk, is the orchestration piece. So again, we've got, and again, I'm not promoting any particular vendor because there's a lot more that's out there, but people were talking about Docker Swarm and Kubernetes and OpenShift, and Kubernetes seems to have done really well recently, so that's the buzz. Everybody's interested in that. Something that I'm a little bit disappointed by, and something that I want you to appreciate or take away from this particular session, is that you should make sure you understand the difference between what Kubernetes does and what OpenShift does as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go into that, but you really should do a little bit of research on what exactly is Kubernetes versus what is OpenShift trying to do. Okay, so there have been some sessions on Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, and OpenShift, and different flavors of OpenShift. But again, takeaway exercise for you is to understand the difference between the two and what we're trying to do. Because if you're a bank or insurance, a bit more concerned about security and these sorts of things, you need to understand the difference between those two. Otherwise, no doubt you've also seen a lot of microservices is the new black or whatever. So again, it's not really appropriate for our talk because we're talking about existing production workloads into containers and Kubernetes and those sorts of things there. But obviously, if you're building a greenfield microservices architecture, then obviously containers, and there's some interest there for you in that particular case there. And again, I found this really interesting that Linux usage in Azure has surpassed Windows as of July 2019. Excuse me. So again, just a nice, interesting water cooler fact. Okay, and I've just got a couple of screenshots, as I said, of some of these things in the industry here. So again, you can see as of, Windows Server 2016, Docker Enterprise has been put and baked into the product. So again, this is what Microsoft sees strategically, the Windows Server team sees strategically as well there. So it's something that you should be thinking about with how we're going to be running SQL Server going forward, and should we be transitioning to this particular infrastructure architecture going forward as well there. Because it certainly seems to be the soup of the day there. You might be aware of the fact that VMware just recently, within the last month or two, announced Project Pacific. So again, they're going to be slowly moving to a container-based architecture. So we still have the richness of vSphere, the management, control plane, all of those sorts of things there, but they're going to be investing more in containers running inside their ecosystem in this particular case. And again, you can see that Kubernetes seems to have won the orchestration engine, so they're going to be leveraging Kubernetes in this particular case. So again, you could be running Kubernetes, you could be running traditional VMs, you can be running containers, etc., and you'll be going to be doing it through their product going forward in this particular case there. So again, this seems to be the way vendors are going with this particular technology. So again, I very much liken this to what was happening with 2000 when VMware first came out and there was resistance and we don't want to run SQL Server Tier 1 solutions in hypervisor, on top of hypervisors. We want to run them on bare metal, whereas now running SQL Server Tier 1 solutions on VMs is natural. We've got cloud providers that are doing it. So we don't question that anymore. So again, I can see parallels to what's happened with virtualization and what's going to be happening with containers as well. So again, just be aware of that and again, do some research if you want to, as the case might be. I actually found this interesting. So again, you can see, as I said, there's been a lot of interest in Kubernetes. So I just did a little bit of a Google Trend search in this case, and you can see that Kubernetes has really picked up since about 2016 in this particular case, as you can see. Okay, I should stop saying as you can see. Does anyone have any questions about this particular slide? I can read your mind. So what's your name? My
question's actually on the last slide.
Oh, okay. Quickly fire it off and get a sticker.
You mentioned that the VMware is essentially going to encompass Kubernetes. And I'm ready to go to my system guys and say, implement Kubernetes, that's where we're going in the future. We already have VMware.
Yep.
Pretty well developed setup. Do I say, never mind, wait until the VMware comes out and we'll already have Kubernetes? Is that what I'm saying here?
Yes-ish. They still have to build this product. I hate saying yes, I hate saying no. I did a computer science degree and I did a law degree, so I don't want to ever say yes or no because I can get sued. So yes and no. So that is the vision, but whether it manifests itself and how long it's going to take to do that, this is hot off the press. So yes, I believe that is their intent, but I don't work for VMware. Okay, but yes, absolutely. Would you like a sticker? Okay, sorry, what's your name? Wayne. And the more interesting question that Wayne asked, that was interesting as well, is why do we have those little dips in the trend lines? Can anybody answer that question? See all those little dips, they seem to be every so often. Just before at least, I was curious, like that stood out, and I was like, oh, okay, it's Christmas. So nobody's doing search on Kubernetes or Docker during the Christmas period, but then it seems to spike over New Year's Eve, so anyway. I was just preempting a question, but nobody asked that. Okay, so what would be another interesting comparison in trends and interest level? We'll be here till midnight if nobody answers a question. Hey, what do you work with every day inside your organization? Why are you here? Something called SQL Server. So let's have a comparison of SQL Server to this. So as you can see, SQL Server interest has been waning a little bit, as you can see. So slowly going down. I thought this was interesting as well in the case that, if you go back to 2014, as you can see, there's interest in SQL Server. So does that mean people know everything about SQL Server and therefore aren't doing any searches on anything? Or again, people are moving to other relational database engines instead. So again, you can see that's a downward trend obviously there. And here was something that I also found very, very interesting because then I put in adding Linux. So if you kind of have a look at that, you can see the massive interest in Linux earlier on. And this was interesting to me because I was speaking at a Google thing back home in Sydney, and it was for Linux people, etc. And it was interesting because I was a little bit disappointed, let's say, about the knowledge that seemed to be coming from the room with Linux administrators and people, etc. So I know that you're SQL Server experts, you've probably been living and breathing Windows Server as well for the last decade, so you know obviously a lot about the operating system. But it was interesting because in that space people weren't aware of what NUMA was and how it works and how Linux, etc. works on NUMA. And we're running SQL Server on machines with terabytes of memory and 4 NUMA nodes or 2 NUMA nodes and multiple processors and crying about the licensing cost of running on those particular machines. But we seem to be more au fait about these sorts of things, and I think that's interesting because one of the questions that I have is how well will SQL Server run on big iron machines, on Superdome machines, and those sorts of things there. So again, sure, you're spinning up containers with 4, 6, 18 gigs of memory, who cares? But I'm interested in running production workloads with my customers on 128 cores and 2 terabytes of memory. Will it work in this particular scenario as well? So let's talk a little bit about containers to make sure that people understand that. So again, I think pulled this off the Docker website there. So you can see what they're doing in this particular case is just making a comparison between how, sort of the high-level architecture of how virtual machines run versus containers. So I'll let you look at that at your own leisure. But the important thing, as you can see, we've got the underlying infrastructure there, we've got a hypervisor, and then we have the virtual machines with a guest operating system running there on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we've basically got containers, which are fundamentally just multiple applications that are isolated through Linux, running on top of Docker, running on top of the host operating system. So would there be any concerns on the architecture on the right-hand side? So again, you can see we've got infrastructure, host operating system, the Docker engine, and then multiple containers, applications running in those things. What's the fundamental difference between those two architectures? What's the potential concern? So single points of failure. There's going to be multiple, absolutely, but not what I'm after. Security, yes. So the interesting thing here, and the thing that you need to appreciate from the very, very start is that on the left-hand side, we have a hypervisor and we have different operating systems running which have a kernel and then things running in user space. Okay? Whereas in the right-hand side with containers, what have we got? We've got one host operating system, so one kernel, and then all the SQL servers are running in user space, let's say effectively. So again, there's some issues for me straight away with security. So you're sharing a kernel. And in this day and age where you've got Spectre, Meltdown, all these sorts of things, what are the security implications of going to this architecture on the right-hand side? Because again, we're just isolating things at the application layer. We're not doing it through a hypervisor, through Hyper-V or VMware or whatever the case is. So again, that should be raising potentially some concerns for those of you that are more concerned about security with what's going to happen when we have things running. We're isolating things only at the application level in this particular case, and we're sharing the single kernel in this particular instance. Otherwise, conceptually, we've been doing this for years. I used to work for a bank back in the 90s, and back then, they had a standard build of SQL Server where they would buy their HCL-approved hardware, and they would have multiple instances of SQL Server running on that machine. So they used to have a standard of 4 SQL Server instances per HP, whatever, DL, whatever it was, back in the day there. So again, lay down the hardware, lay down the Windows, and then have 1 default instance and 3 named instances of SQL Server. Okay? If you've got a failover cluster, you can have multiple SQL Server failover cluster instances running on that. So in terms of a paradigm of running multiple applications on one OSC, one operating system environment, we've been doing that for decades now at the end of the day. So you shouldn't be concerned about at that level, what's the difference between running containers applications versus virtual machines, because we've been doing that with SQL Server for quite a long time anyway. So there's nothing wrong with that. But if you used to do this back in the 90s or you're still doing that, you would know that I connect to SQL Server default instance using port 1433. What about the rest of them? I either have to use the named instance and we connect to the browser and then it redirects us to the correct port, but I also can connect to that particular SQL 2 or SQL 3 named instance directly, but how do I connect to it directly by not using its named instance name? Through the port, you have to specify the port number. So forget about saying, it's server 1/SQL 2. I can specify the port name, let's say the IP address, DNS center, etc., and I can connect to that SQL Server instance directly by explicitly putting in the port number. So the idea here is in this particular bank, they used to have all SQL servers inside the organization running on different port numbers and kept the register of that. So it was a really well-maintained system. And we've sort of lost that discipline. But now it might be making more of a comeback because we're going to have to worry about ports and those sorts of things if we're going to be running SQL Server in containers. So something that might have been standard a while ago sort of went away because, who cares, we just use the browser and we connect using named instances. But there again, there's some benefits of connecting to SQL Server through ports that you have defined, documented. They don't change, they're static, you map them, go through firewalls to control security audits, etc., etc., etc. So that sort of paradigm is going to come back in a way with containers, if you like, there. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. So again, if you went to some of the container sessions, etc., hopefully they would have talked about the container lifecycle. So talking about the fact that you have a container registry that you use to pull down the images from Microsoft. There have been some changes there over the course of the year. So you pull down an image. You can use Docker files to customize that. You can have your own container registry. Then you spin up containers, run them, stop, start, remove them, and those sorts of things like that. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do here is highlight the fact that this is what you're going to have to invest in. So you either as the infrastructure, DBA, or whatever you are, or get a team together that's going to do some work in this particular space and have a good story to tell to management and the benefits thereof of going to this particular architecture. So start to investigate, what do we do with Docker files? How do we best build Docker files or customize images and these sorts of things like that? Which some organizations have already done through PowerShell and ServiceNow and Virtual Machine Manager and vSphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then it's about leveraging those best practices and scripts that you have and moving them across to this particular world. But if you haven't done that, you're going to have to go through that particular process. There's going to be more work involved than you just spinning up containers randomly up and down and those sorts of things like that. So again, you need to invest in this technology and start to research and work out what's going on. So the power of containers, as you can see, is that you have this registry where you can deploy from, so they're consistent. It's not you running a SQL Server setup and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and then you have different .NET files and then there's something goes wrong, so let's just kill off this VM and start fresh because we don't trust this image now, this VM to run SQL Server anymore. So again, you've got really nice consistency with deploying SQL Server from containers, and it's just the necessary binaries to run SQL Server. We don't have Windows Server and all the other bits and pieces and .NET and Internet Explorer and Edge and those sorts of things like that there. You know, obviously customizing the images, I've underlined that, is quite important. So that's giving you the power of what you can do with, have a standard controlled build of SQL Server, and then it's easier to troubleshoot, optimize, control performance, troubleshoot performance, and those sorts of things. You're going to have to look at an orchestration engine, so understand the difference between, you know, should we be using Docker Swarm or Kubernetes or OpenShift. So they're going to have all of their pros and cons. Okay, so we're not answering any questions in this case. We're making you aware of these sorts of things. And again, highlighting that you really should be looking at, for example, the difference between Kubernetes and OpenShift, because I'm not sure whether that has been well discussed or well highlighted at this conference and previous conferences, be they Microsoft or whatever the case is there. The two fundamental issues, as I see, that we have inside SQL Server, running SQL Server on containers, is basically the persistent storage problem and the port numbers as well. So again, if you've been going to these particular sessions, you'll realize that, you know, we're using port 1433 internally, but externally through the host, we have to use a different port number because we can't connect to all of these SQL Server containers running inside our environment there. So again, we're going to have to go through that process of defining some standards and mapping ports and controlling all of this. It's not particularly difficult. It's a discipline that, as I said, some organizations used to have inside a long time ago. But again, that's going to make a little bit of a comeback, if you like, there. Gentleman earlier on that got one of these highly prized stickers before the session started came up and asked, what about storage? What's the story with storage and decoupling storage? So containers were designed initially to be stateless. So again, we shut down the container, everything inside the container is lost. And then when we spin up a container, it's exactly the same way, runs exactly the same way because it's, again, exactly the same image. So that's the benefit. But obviously we have databases. We don't want to lose data inside the databases there. So again, there's been some discussions in various sessions and talking about persisted volumes and persisted volume claims. But again, there's a lot of nuance and decisions that you're going to have to make as to how we're going to do storage inside this particular world here. So I'm not sure if I would want a container spinning up and doing all this stuff with persisted volumes when it's a 5 terabyte database or a 6 terabyte database. These sorts of things. How are we going to manage corruptions if there's a corruption there? So they had problems with databases and corruption. So is there a better way of doing these sorts of things there? The other question that actually comes up quite a bit is licensing. Licensing is no different. Okay, so in terms of licensing, I think Microsoft is saying, well, the way you license containers is pretty much the same story as what you do with VMs. Because as I'm sure you've heard, containers is V2 of virtualization and VMs and those sorts of things like that. So if you understand SQL Server licensing, that means what? You're very smart or you're a liar. So it's one of the two, black or white. It's very binary here. Okay, so if you understand SQL Server licensing, there's no change as a result of it being deployed through containers. Containers are actually quite nice in a way because, you know, you run 100 instances of SQL Server through containers or whatever, and it's like, oh my God, the auditors are coming, quick. Shut them down. Oh, we only have to pay a little bit of licensing, and then as soon as the auditors walk out the door, you spin up the containers. Okay? Please don't do that, okay? But or do that, but don't tell me. Yes, question?
So you mean that the container is to be considered as a VM during license?
Correct.
But you just said that it was more to be seen as an instance in the cluster, and you can have different instances on the license for the cores.
Okay, so the question was, you've said that it's like a VM, but you're going to have multiple instances. That's where it gets complicated, but the design's going to be important. And I might also add that Microsoft changed licensing with some HADR considerations in mind just recently. I can take that offline a little bit. But as I said, for all intents and purposes, at a high level, the way you license VMs and containers is exactly the same. Okay? It's a little bit more nuanced and complicated than that, okay? But as I said, there's nothing special. But then how you design this architecture on containers can make a massive difference on your licensing costs as well, okay? Or we can take that offline because I don't want to be recorded with some of the things I might say. Microsoft is poor. They need money as well, so, they've got children to feed. Okay, but as I said, there's no difference with licensing. There's no difference with licensing, so there's nothing special going on in this particular case here. So this slide's actually from Microsoft, so it's again talking about data persistence. So I think you'll see in the conferences they've been talking about how you need to have a mount point in var optim MS SQL and talk about, as you can see, you've got data in a host and persistent volume claims and all sorts of things like that. I think Microsoft should probably spend a bit more time explaining the options in this particular area here. Because for me, one of the really interesting possibilities in this is to decouple your storage from containers. So don't do it as containers within the container or data volumes within the container. I'm actually more interested about what I was talking about earlier on. So imagine you have some sort of storage layer and you're accessing it through SMB3. So you're not accessing it through NFS or anything like that, but again, you're running it off shares effectively. So go to /storage/SQL Server Instance /directory name /master.mdf LDF and the user database files. Because that to me presents some really interesting opportunities. So we have containers running in Kubernetes or whatever, spinning up, and they're running off SMB shares, which is on a different device there. For me, that's potentially really good for performance. It's also mitigating risk because you think, oh, okay, for whatever reason, this container stuff doesn't work with this instance of SQL Server or whatever, I don't know. What do you need to do in this particular case? Quickly spin up a VM in Hyper-V or VMware or whatever and attach to that same SMB share with the master system databases, MDF file, LDF file, and you're up and running in seconds. Okay, so there's some really interesting possibilities here. So I'm surprised that nobody's talked a lot more about the options that you have with data persistence, and maybe vendors should be doing that, I don't know. But that for me is something that is quite important. So that I think would be, I don't know if that's the right answer, but I'm excited about that possibility of you running SQL Server in containers of shares. And you've completely decoupled the storage layer from the compute layer in this particular case there, because there are some benefits. Oh, we need to do a backup or a refresh in UAT. Oh, that's easy. Shut down that container, copy the MDF and the LDF file across to another instance, and then spin it up, or use cloning or whatever the case is. So there's some interesting possibilities there, I think. So I'm sort of thinking about that and wrapping my head around that, and hopefully working with customers when we go down this particular path. But something that I think, as I said, hasn't been discussed enough, and again, something that you should be taking away, an important takeaway from this session, and thinking about and having a look at the options and different providers and those sorts of things like that, depending on who you use. I'm not going to name any vendors. I don't think this is a big deal, but we'll complete it for argument's sake. Well, okay, so this is just talking about the fact that when you're running SQL Server in containers, you can use Linux containers or you can use Windows containers there. So you can see that in this particular example, I've just spun up well, this is for a Linux container, so I'm just showing you the size. So it might be a little bit difficult to read there, but somewhere on that particular page, I've got a SQL 2017 and a SQL Server 2019 image downloaded. And it's about 1.4, 1.5 gigabytes respectively. So the image sizes for Linux containers for SQL are quite small, as you can see, 1.5 gigabytes in size. Okay? If you go, however, and this is just showing an example where I've spun up a whole bunch of containers, SQL Server instances. So I've got SQL Server 2017A through to D, then SQL 2019 A through to E. And you can see the port mappings and the IP addresses on the right-hand side, etc. So you've seen demonstrations, hopefully, of how easy this is to do, absolutely. But just because you can doesn't mean you should. You still, I think, need to define some good standards and patterns and processes around this. So again, for a development environment, this might be quite good. If you're running your whole bank on something like this, well, it's going to require a little bit more thought. It's not you haphazardly spinning up containers now just because you can. And again, just showing you, like in Portainer, how you've got some statistics on memory usage, CPU, and these sorts of things. Not too much to add to that, so I'll leave that alone. This is just highlighting the fact that if we go to Windows containers, you can see it's a little bit more bloated. So we had 1.5 gigabytes, whereas Windows containers are 15 gigabytes in size. So again, Microsoft's giving you the option of doing this, but again, it'll be up to you as to whether you want to do something like this. So the implication obviously is that SQL containers are leaner and meaner, and hopefully you'll get better performance. I don't know if that's actually true these days, but as I said, you might be able to do some more things with Windows containers with legacy applications and those sorts of things. But just be aware of the fact that there's a different size to the containers. Yes?
What does that size
The binary, the files, the DLLs and the executables, those sorts of things, which are then going to run in memory.
Of just SQL, right?
Correct. SQL and its bits. So yeah, absolutely. So effectively, you don't have a full operating system. So it's just the apps and DLLs and a bit of magic, binary magic. So that's what that represents. Okay. So again, I don't think it's really that relevant. So developer edition versus express edition, as you can see, 13.8 gigabytes. Why? Because I'm used to running SQL Server on machines with a terabyte of memory or 768 gigs of memory. So I don't think that's a big deal in the scheme of things. So you're saving a little bit of space there, except I'm actually wrong, because when you're running things in the cloud, it does make a big deal potentially. Okay? What's the one thing they can't over-provision in the cloud? If my question makes sense. So your SQL Server needs three things. It needs a network. Well, it needs more than a network. It needs storage. Storage is cheap. It needs CPUs, and it needs memory. So you can over-provision memory. So you can give 100 instances of SQL Server 4 cores, even though your box only has 4 cores. But you can't over-provision memory and get good performance with SQL Server. Because if you're buying a 10 gig VM in the cloud, you want to be using 10 gig. You don't want it to be swapped out to disk or anything like that. So as I said, these things might make don't care because we're running it on-prem. But if you're running it in the cloud where you will be charged for the actual memory consumption, maybe you do want to use a Linux container because you're giving more memory to the buffer pool and therefore get better performance in that particular case there. So as I said, thinking might change depending on whether you're doing this on-prem or in the cloud. Yes, sir? But you still need to run the binaries in memory as well. Sure. So yeah, it's not a direct correlation. Okay, but there is, as I said, if you're running things at scale or whatever, possibly. I don't know that. As I said, I don't know that. But as I said, that's why I don't think it's relevant, but it might be. Okay. Again, I don't want to say yes or no. That's the reason for the thinking. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the potential. As I said, at the end of the day, Microsoft, I don't think, is saying you must use this or you must use this. They're giving you more options there. So yes, you can run SQL on Windows and stay where you are. You can run SQL Server on Linux. You can run SQL Server in containers. And you've got two choices as far as the underlying container technology, Windows or Linux, as we saw there. So they're not forcing you down a particular path. So you're coming to these conferences and you're seeing the fact that they're talking about Kubernetes and containers, and think, oh my God, they're abandoning Windows. No. It runs on Windows. There's nothing too new. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to improve that, etc. But we're giving you a new paradigm, a new control plane, a new way of actually running SQL Server. And you can see all of the different vendors are jumping on board inside this particular technology. So as I said, it's all about choice. I don't think Microsoft's forcing you down any particular path in this particular case there. It's opening up some interesting possibilities for Microsoft. So down the track, we'll see an evergreen version of SQL where, again, you just deploy SQL like Windows 10. It'll just keep upgrading it, and you don't have to worry about SQL 2017 versus 2019 versus 2021 versus 2023. You just keep patching SQL Server there. So that's where we're heading. When and whether we get there is another matter. But as I said, that's what I think the thinking is behind or the options that Microsoft have with going down this particular path there. So again, I've seen the conferences and gone to a lot of them. Microsoft, I think, is very excited about the potential for containers with SQL Server. But it's also driven by adoption. So if people aren't using this particular technology, if people aren't using BDCs and these sorts of things, then again, Microsoft, we might need to rethink something or change our messaging or whatever the case is. But as I said, I suspect this is very much the beginning of the journey. So we saw people, again, resisting running SQL Server Tier 1 production workloads in VMware and other hypervisors, and now it's become the norm. So I think it's exactly the same thing going on at this particular point in time. So it won't take as long, it might be 5-7 years and maybe 2 releases of SQL Server because, again, people need to refresh hardware and things like that, and people might be moving into the cloud. But again, there's some risks as well with being an early adopter and the associated benefits as well. So again, I suppose the session is trying to highlight, do the research, do some investigation, think about what's the best way of deploying SQL inside this particular world here. So I've just stolen some benefits of Microsoft. So this is like Microsoft have been talking about at Ignite and other conferences. So again, portable, lightweight, consistent, efficient, these sorts of things. Yeah, sure, absolutely, absolutely. But there's also potentially some downsides which, again, you live with or you mitigate as the case might be. At the end of the day, you know, they're saying faster patching. I think, well, who cares? All of my customers don't patch SQL Server anyway. They've been running for 20 years on SQL Server 2005 RTM. You know, I was like, oh, so what's the big deal? They're scared of patching anyway. So whether you're running it in containers or on Windows, it makes no difference. The answer to that particular problem is to mitigate risk by making sure that database compatibility is such that you can go down to an early compat level and guarantee the same level of no query regression, those sorts of things like that. So sometimes, as I said, it's like, oh, you know, it's going to be faster because it has a smaller memory footprint. My laptop has 128 gigabytes of memory, you know. So again, some of these things, hardware costs have really come down. So some of these things aren't that relevant possibly anymore. Although again, well, not as relevant, they are relevant. But again, the potential's there. So if you haven't seen this, this is quite interesting where, again, hopefully you might have seen this. So we're talking about, you know, different paradigm for patching. So again, people are always concerned about patching. If you're running SQL in containers, there's no need to patch the Windows operating system because you don't have effectively an operating system in this particular case. So you've got the SQL Server and associated binaries, DLLs, the SQL Power Layer, put into a container image, you download it and run it, and that's it. So there's no need to patch Windows. You might still have Windows Server Core, you know, you have to reboot a server, server's got 1 terabyte of memory. It's going to take a long time for that machine to do the memory check before it can actually spin up Windows to spin up SQL or whatever the case might be. Yes, question?
You also assuming, though, that if you're running multiple containers on a production box, that the one OS that you're patching, all of them are going to be compatible and not have hiccups because of that patch. It's not independent.
So yeah, there's dependencies with the underlying host and operating. The question is this, absolutely. And that's where I think it's important for you to go off and investigate Kubernetes versus OpenShift versus what's happening at the host layer and how these different technologies and products work, whether you should be using Ubuntu or RHEL, etc. So that's the important questions that you need to be asking and researching and mitigating that risk. Absolutely. Okay, absolutely. Yes? So patching the... well, you don't necessarily run the Docker engine. So there are alternatives, the Docker engine as well. So as I said, that layer, yes, absolutely. So yes, of course, you need to do that. But recently, Microsoft have made some announcements of being able to patch a running SQL Server without a restart. So hot patching. And again, Linux does things like that as well. So again, as I said, that now depends on Docker and Ubuntu and RHEL and OpenShift and these sorts of things like that. Okay? So again, as I understand it, RHEL OpenShift doesn't use a Docker engine. They use their own engine. Okay? And they're running some core, and that gets patched automatically for you. So again, these are the questions you should be asking, but not of me because I don't know. Ask me next year. Or give me the answer, and then I'll be able to answer. So these are the questions that we need to be asking to mitigate the risk, to give us confidence in deploying SQL Server in this environment and get the benefits of that. Okay? Things always work at presentations. Things always work on the whiteboard. But the reality of running all of your core banking systems and betting systems on this is another matter. Okay? So you just need to ask the right questions and do some research and mitigate any risk. But you can see with patching, the point here is that, you know, with patching SQL Server in containers, it's quite easy. So you see over here we're running SQL CU5, and then what happens is we need to patch to SQL Server CU6. All we need to do is download that particular image and run it. So effectively, we attach the SQL Server CU6 binaries to the database file. So that should be seconds in this particular case. It might do some things to system databases as it does, etc. But as I said, it should be a relatively straightforward process. You know, the next time around, we want to patch the SQL Server CU7. So bang, off we go, and we do the same thing. And then, of course, something goes wrong. So what do we do? Well, what we do in this particular case is sort of like detach SQL Server 6 back to, we attach SQL Server CU6 back to those particular database files there. The holy grail, obviously, is what? Microsoft decoupling the database version from the SQL Server version. So if this is now SQL Server 2021, and you can go backwards to SQL Server 2019, that would be really, really good. okay, because now you completely mitigate the risk of upgrades. So sure, we can do things in database compatibility level, so that's one way to do it. But the other way possibly, I don't think so, but possibly, again, somebody will come up with some sort of strategy, re-architecture the format of MDF files and LDF files, and again, we can go backwards to versions of SQL Server. Okay, so there's different paths that Microsoft can take, but obviously I don't work for them, so I don't know. The interesting thing here is that there's no need to patch the Windows operating system. So again, if you've ever had to do that, that's a painful process in clusters and things like that. So it can take a while to reboot, and it's like, why? It shouldn't take that long, but it is what it is. So, and this is also sort of a segue into the high availability space, because again, when you think about it, with high availability, what's happening is that we're sort of, something's gone wrong with this SQL Server container that's running, let's kill it off and spin up the other one there. So watch this particular space. So high availability is another interesting area that we sort of will touch upon later on inside this particular presentation. Okay. This is possibly something that we could be doing. So how many people are running SQL Server with hundreds of databases? And you've got databases like, what's that database that's a virus? SharePoint. So SharePoint's running. It's killing the performance of everything else. Okay? So again, wouldn't it be nice to isolate that? So have a SQL instance running SharePoint, a SQL Server instance running Veeam, a SharePoint instance running the VMware stuff, a SQL Server instance running Link, etc., etc. Each one has its own temp DB, each one has its own set of logins. They're isolated in this particular case. Sure, we could do that right now, but it's going to take, is it worth your while? It's going to be complicated. Then you have so many SQL instances, then you have to patch them, etc., etc., etc. So you get this amplification effect there. So you can see in this particular proof of concept I've got here, you've got these three applications with the different databases that they're connecting to, which are color-coded, and we're running them on the same SQL Server instance. But maybe going forward, you come up with a design and a strategy where you're going to, sort of wrap this all up in different silos. So application 1 connects to a SQL Server instance with those databases. And that can be on CU6. Application 2 running on SQL Server 2 container with, again, 3 databases running on CU7. And it's easier for you to upgrade because, again, sometimes, we can't upgrade SQL Server because we've got 100 databases there, but these 10 we can't because it doesn't support, the vendor doesn't support that. But now what we've done is we've isolated the different SQL engines on the different databases or cluster or container of databases. So we can do some really interesting things. So that's where I think this is the potential. So it's not about the mechanics of running Kubernetes or things like that. It's now the business benefits and tactically and strategically what you can do with how you're going to deploy SQL Server inside your organization. So again, no noisy databases there. You don't have to be worried about somebody flicking on cross-database security mechanism and injection and these sorts of things there, because now it's easy to isolate databases from each other through SQL Server instances and patch them and manage them and those sorts of things. Each one's got its own dedicated temp DB, improved performance, administration through isolation, improved security, because you don't have 100 logins. You have logins that are dedicated to that application just within that particular SQL Server container there. So some interesting things. So as I said, I'm not too fussed about these demonstrations and what people are talking about. I'm interested in the potential here for how you run SQL Server inside your fleet of SQL servers. So let's move on to challenges, concerns, and risks. So obviously one of the challenges is this is inherently complicated or complex because it's new to us. So we've been running SQL Server on Windows for the last decade, and now we're coming to these conferences and we're learning about all these technologies where we can't pronounce the name. Speakers up on stage even have a cheat sheet of, this particular technology uses A, B, C, D, and all these weird names. So again, there's complexity because it's new to us. So again, Docker, containers, Kubernetes, OpenShift. So again, are you going to learn this technology, or are you going to get experts to come in and help you out with this sort of thing like that? So again, inherent complexity because it's new. At the end of the day, if you get it right, obviously you're going to see a lot of benefits of this. But again, there's going to be this pain point in the industry. So a lot of it will depend on your experience with being able to define processes and standard builds or standard operating environments, so is for SQL Server. So if you've been doing that, Ask management to send you to, I don't know, the Bahamas and sit there for 6 months and play around with this technology and work out, this is the standards, this is what we're going to do, this is the technology we're going to deploy, this is going to be the new SOE for SQL Server for Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, we're going to use Kubernetes, here's proof of concepts on Docker files or this or that, etc. So again, this is what I think people should be doing potentially after these particular sessions. Get excited and interested about the technology, but go away and sit down and think about, well, this is how we want to run SQL Server going forward, because it's, I think, been a little bit unmanageable for a lot of organizations through bloat and creep and those sorts of things over the last decade there. And everybody's getting more complicated, so more SQL Server instances, larger databases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's make life easy for us in the decade going forward. Another important point is basic availability. I think we've been spoilt in the SQL Server world. So I've just stolen this from somebody's slide deck. So we've got basic availability inside Kubernetes. So we've got a cluster here, we've got different nodes here, we've got our storage down the bottom. So we've got SQL Server running in a particular pod. And so it's starting up, it accesses the databases. The application is connecting to that SQL Server container through the load balancer. Something obviously is going to go wrong. So that particular SQL Server dies, something goes wrong at the pod level. Kubernetes is going to spin it up in another pod on the same node in this particular example. Then what happens is the actual node dies, so we're going to spin up a pod on node number 3 in this particular case. So that's all really good, but what's the important question that people should be asking here? Yeah, so how does the app react? Yes? I'm after another one. If the overall structure fails, that's easy. Just go. Go home. Go to the pub. Go to the bar. Go to the beach. Sorry? State of the data? Yeah, that should be okay. So you're all asking good questions, but not the one I'm after. So.
I mean, this is one of the cases, like if I influence the Microsoft Data Cluster instance, we have shared.
Yeah. So similar. Yeah, but that's the next slide will be talking about failover cluster instances because of the question that you need to ask when you've looked at that, which I'm waiting for. How quickly does this happen? Okay. Does this take a minute or 10 seconds or a second or a day for it to detect the auto failure? So I've been talking, don't work with them, with the clustering team and Hyper-V team and VMware team. So again, just because your application or a process can't communicate to SQL Server doesn't mean it's crashed. Okay? The network could be down or could just be slow. It'll respond eventually. So clustering doesn't automatically, SQL Server, I can't seem to communicate, fail over. It retries a number of times. It's got a timeout that you can control. Same with availability groups. We've been spoiled for choice. That's where I'm going on the next slide. So how quickly does this automatically happen? Because if you're running, again, an online gambling or betting or whatever, you want it to be as quick as possible, okay? So again, will this work with SQL Server? And again, I think with SQL Server 2019 release, not everything's built with the release RTM of SQL Server 2019. So sure, Kubernetes will do that natively, but maybe the failover won't be fast enough. So you need to put an AG on top of that because that's going to be faster and it will detect a failure. Because remember, with things like AG and FCIs, you can control the degree of failoverness, making up a word. In other words, you've got different layers of when you think it should fail over. It's not just because it's a crash. It could also be because something's hung or performance is slow. How many people have had a cluster fail over even though nothing's failed, like there's no storage failure or CPU or VM failure? Yeah, a few people. It's designed to do that. It's like, something's wrong, let's fail over. Okay, so you've got different tweaks and things like that. So again, that's going to be another important component with high availability. So you can see the title here is basic availability, not high availability. So again, we've been spoiled for choice in SQL Server with, with high availability. So we've got failover cluster instances, we've got availability groups, and all of these things can be tweaked through the registry. We've got that health service that runs inside SQL Server. This combination of events is going to trigger over a failover. So you have a degree of sensitivity. We also have live migration vMotion. So again, we can move things in memory in Hyper-V or VMware. So should you do high availability in SQL Server or at the hypervisor layer. What we've seen so far in all these sessions in Kubernetes is just SQL Server crashing. But maybe you want to move things across and memory because of that node's really busy, the pod's being overloaded, etc. So Hyper-V and all these guys, VMware, have this capability here. So again, something that you need to think about in this particular instance there.
So that leads to another question that,
Sorry? Yep.
that there is the option of having containers over the bare metal or having containers over the VMs.
Correct, yeah, yeah. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, possibly. It depends on the vendors, but yeah, there's different ways in which you can set that up. And that's, again, something I think somebody should be doing. I think there was one session here of how to deploy Kubernetes in VMware. But again, the focus has been more running it in, what's that thing above us? Yeah, cloud. If you're from Seattle, you know what I mean. Okay. So yeah, so again, there's been more of that. But as I said, if you're doing this on premises or you want to play around with it in a home lab or something like that, there's different ways in which you can build that. I wish they did a better job of messaging that. But my take, let me take that offline, so it doesn't get recorded. Okay, so again, the point is, as I said, we've got a rich set of functionality, features, pedigree, and history with running SQL Server in HA environments, and there's always been, do we use AGs, or do we use log shipping, or do we use failover clusters? You can combine them, as you know. We've got distributed availability groups. You can tweak all of these things as well. You've got vMotion, live migration, etc. Now, how is that going to now play out in this new particular space over here? Because it's very, very simplistic compared to what we've been used to inside this. So watch this space, because I think Microsoft's going to be doing some interesting things in this particular space as well. Challenges. Well, the challenge obviously is that you've got all of this new technology, and a lot of it's been abstracted from you. So at that sort of basic level, we're talking about Linux and Docker, containers, Kubernetes, and yeah, some of these things are important, some of these things aren't important. So it depends on how much you're going to customize containers and images and those sorts of things like that. You know, I've seen demonstrations where people are doing, oh, look, we're spinning up a container, then we're running a script, and then we're doing a restore of a backup. Well, that's not going to work for a 7 terabyte database, is it? That's going to take you 2 days to bring that container online in that particular case there. So, you know, for big systems, large databases, we need to do things a little bit differently. So everything works when it's a small database and you're spinning up little containers and these sorts of things. Microsoft have really tried to make it easier for you to administer. So again, the investment in Azure Data Studio and big data clusters, there's a lot of moving pieces behind the scenes there. And you'll see things with Azure Arc and what their initiative is in this particular case. There's a lot of moving pieces in this particular case. So is Microsoft, or are you expecting yourself to be an expert in all of this technology? Or no, you're just buying into like an appliance and it works, and you know, somebody else's, hopefully it's stable and runs on these sorts of things. But as I said, it's going to be challenging to find somebody who knows all of this to the nth degree. Whereas I think we as SQL Server experts have been really, really good at, you know, we know the internals of SQL, sys indexes, column store indexes, B trees, etc. We're sort of really deep into the SQL engine and the operating system. Whereas this, like, I'm not going to invest in all of this. You can if you want. And, you know, please then answer all the questions I'll have in this particular area. But it's just going to be too much for any single individual, obviously, there. So there's going to be some challenges here that, again, might negate people jumping into this early on in the piece as things crystallize. Here's your typical container expert. What are they interested in? Their beard. They're all hipsters. They don't care about indexes and performance and these sorts of things. That's untenable for SQL Server. Okay? How does it work with SQL Server in this case? I don't know. How does SQL containers work with Linux in this? I don't know. How does it work on NUMA? I don't know. What's NUMA? These are questions we've had to address in the last decade to make sure that SQL Server runs quickly. The other thing I've noticed is what do Linux experts look like? Remember the interest level? Linux has been around from 2000. So again, you've got all these people that are not in their 20s, and they seem to have gotten angrier and angrier and angrier, like DBAs. So again, the container people, in my experience, seem to be like, oh, I don't worry about these things because I'm more interested in orchestration and scripting, etc. I don't know what's happening at the kernel level and Kubernetes, etc. And then you've got the Linux people as well. Obviously, this is not quite true. It's supposed to be a bit of a joke, but certainly As I said, that's going to be a challenge for you. So are you going to invest in this and learn all of this yourself, and you've got 20 years of Linux experience to catch up on and 7 years of container experience to catch up on, or are you going to engage experts in this? If you're going to engage experts, they need to know a little bit about SQL Server, potentially, or not. So these are, again, what you're going to have to decide inside your organization. So again, there's a whole bunch of concerns that haven't been addressed inside any of these talks in this particular space there. So again, this is a simple one, feature parity. Not everything that is available inside SQL Server on Windows is potentially available in SQL Server in containers there. So some stuff will be in SQL Server 2019 containers, but not in 2017 containers. So things like replication weren't available. Now we've got replication, CDC, these sorts of things like that. So again, that's something that you're going to have to chase up, address. These are the dependencies. Will these things work with SQL Server in container? Because we don't have full feature parity there. Okay. The other thing that nobody's talked about is compliance governance. So we have PCI compliance or HIPAA or GDPR, whatever, or we've got all these tools. So that vendor's full of different tool vendors selling different monitoring solutions, auditing solutions, etc. Will that work with containers? They install an agent on Windows Server. Well, that's not going to work in a container potentially. Okay, what are you going to do with antivirus software? So antivirus software is typically install a filter driver into the Windows operating system. Well, guess what? There is no Windows operating system in this particular case there with containers there. So again, what are you going to do? Are we going to do it at the host level? Well, do we have antivirus software at the host level on which you're running containers? Because you'll have governance compliance requirements inside an organization potentially there. So are the tools etc., available at this particular point, because that might be a no-go zone. We won't be PCI compliant because, I don't know, you need to install antivirus software on each SQL Server instance to check a box to meet auditing requirements, otherwise you cop a fine. Well, okay, then we can't implement this at this particular point in time, potentially. We have to wait until the vendor market, other dependencies at the business layer for managing, controlling, administering SQL Server have caught up with this. As I said, we're sort of at not quite day zero, but early on in this particular case. And you can see over there, again, as I've been talking about, third-party tools. Third-party tools have been leveraging perfmon counters and WMI and possibly other bits and pieces inside Windows, etc., which might not exist anymore. So again, sure, we can connect to the endpoint and manage and monitor things through DMVs, but a lot of stuff isn't exposed through DMVs. So what are we going to do in this particular case? Or do we just not care anymore? Because there is no operating system we don't care about. So high CPU usage and that's it. But we don't care about paging and kernel mode versus user mode or whatever, because we can't control it at the end of the day anyway. So again, something the industry, the community is going to have to think about, address as well. In terms of risks, again, I've seen a lot of conferences, people are asking the question, will it work the same way SQL on Linux versus SQL in containers versus SQL on Windows? The important thing to appreciate in this particular case, it's the same binaries. So it's not as if they have source code and then compile for Linux, compile for containers, compile for different distributions of Linux, and then compile for Windows. It's effectively the same executables, DLL, so the same binary files. So it should work all the same. The only difference is going to be now the underlying host. So how does the underlying host work on NUMA? How does Ubuntu work with big systems? How does RHEL work with big systems? That's the question that you should be asking. And then making a decision whether you're going to deploy on this distribution of Linux or this distribution of Linux or this distribution, because you're running much larger systems in this particular case. How is it going to work on 128 cores with a terabyte of memory, because that's what we're running? Would you be nervous moving your banking system to containers that support 128 cores and 1 terabyte of RAM? Who wouldn't be nervous? Okay, well, yeah, you should be. Not to say that it won't, but again, has anybody done that? Are you going to be the first person to do that? It's up to you, okay? The other thing as well is security. So SQL Server 2017, the containers, I think Bob Dorr talked a bit about this in his session, they were running as root containers. So again, that broke a whole bunch of things on different distributions of Linux, because you really don't want everything running as root. So you want to isolate processes, because again, if you're running SQL Server as root, somebody hacks into that SQL Server and then you can attack the host, and then it's game over and everything else running on that host is going to be attacked as well. So in 2019, SQL Server runs as non-root containers there. So again, there's a whole set of issues around security as well that we need to talk about. We have a shared kernel. There's no isolation at the kernel level, as you said, because we're not running different VMs. So again, that requires a bit of investigation, research, and then testing possibly, I don't know, depending on how concerned you are about security and these sorts of things there. So the implementation is easy, but again, whether you're going to move everything across is completely up to you, and these are the sorts of questions that you should be asking. So if I'm scaring you, hopefully that's not my intention, but I'm just raising these concerns. What's the alternative? Well, as I said, there's nothing wrong with you staying on the Windows platform. But maybe this time around, when you upgrade to SQL Server 2019, look at what's happening in the container space and Kubernetes and orchestration and standards and Docker files, etc. Why don't you do the same thing for Windows? It's not impossible. Okay, so next time you upgrade to SQL Server, let's say 2019, develop a whole new process, a new set of processes, a new standard operating environment. Do a whole bunch of SOEs for Tier 1 solutions versus Tier 2 versus Tier 3, because people have been doing this for decades. And then again, be agile, where a database is now more important. So it goes from a Tier 1 SQL Server instance to a Tier 2 Tier 1 SQL Server instance, and vice versa. So maybe it's a little bit more complicated, but there's no reason why you should not be doing this. And then when you want to transition across to container-based technology, it'll be easier, because all you'll be doing is overlaying those best practices, SOEs, build process, etc., from a Windows operating system, let's say running on Windows Server Core, to a container. So again, decouple SQL Server potentially, isolate SQL Server, etc., these sorts of things there. So there's no reason why you can't do this inside Windows. It's a little bit more complicated. You don't have some of the capability, but you should still be doing this. I don't know, I see a lot of organizations which have an organic mess of SQL Server and licensing concerns, and people are stressing out about this, etc., etc. So again, improved performance, improved operational maturity, optimized licensing. You do SQL Server upgrades, you should be able to improve performance and reduce your licensing cost. I've worked with organizations where we triple performance and reduce the licensing by hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million plus. It's possible. But again, people have just organically grown their SQL Server fleet, and they haven't, we've only got 60 SQL Server instances running. Do a bit of analysis. Oh no, you have 300 instances of SQL Server running, not 60. So a lot of people inside that boat. So again, upgrades are a really good opportunity for you to modernize, improve performance, and reduce your licensing cost. So choose your own adventure, SQL Server containers. It's completely up to you. As I said, I'm not saying that you should be going to containers. I'm not saying you should be staying on Windows. It's completely up to you. And I think that's the message from Microsoft as well. We're enabling you with more choices. So maybe you don't want to jump on board this train right now, but you might in 2 years' time, or 2 releases of SQL Server, etc., as the case might be. So it's completely, as I said, up to you. But if you're under the impression that containers is the future and they're sort of dropping Windows, that's not quite the case. Okay? So here's your choose your own venture. You're responsible for deploying and administering your organization's SQL Server infrastructure. You have a mix of SQL Server versions from 2008 to 2016. I was tempted to put in 2000 there, actually. With hundreds of databases which have been deployed haphazardly and organically. You are sick and tired of having to manage all these different versions, fighting vendors, fighting management, putting out fires with performance and other issues. Management keeps blaming you and your team for poor performance. You have had no pay rise and a bonus in 5 years. Management keeps spending money on Power BI consultants. You live in constant fear of SQL Server licensing audit. Management has tasked you with developing a strategy for your SQL Server infrastructure for the next 5 to 10 years. What do you do? Can anybody relate to this? A few people nodding their head? Hopefully it's not this bad. But again, this is the norm, not the exception. So what do you do? Well, number one, what I call balfing, business as usual forever. Keep doing the same thing that you have for the last decade with SQL Server. Realize no benefits of upgrading to later versions of SQL. Keep overpaying for SQL Server licensing. Keep fighting with the users, management, and vendors about performance problems. Your organization loses competitive advantage in the industry. It shuts down in 5 years' time. You cannot get a job as you have kept your skill set, not kept your skill set in demand with industry expectations. Your teeth rot, you go blind, you die young, bitter, twisted, and full of regrets. Do you want that for yourselves? Well, if you do, that's fine. As I said, I'm not forcing you down that particular path. Otherwise, selectively move to containers. You don't have to do everything in one hit. So you can keep your tier 1 things on bare metal or VMs or whatever you're doing at this particular point in time. But what you could conceivably do is selectively move, let's say you do your dev environment, build up confidence, experience with how to do that. Then deploy your tier 3 and tier 2 production workloads into a containerized environment, whatever you decide. On-prem, in the cloud, makes no difference at the end of the day. There's all sorts of announcements, as I said, with VMware, with extending cloud onto prem and Nutanix, and all of these guys are doing the same thing. So you don't have to do it all at the same time. You can run things in the cloud and then vMotion it back into on-prem if you want to. So these capabilities are there in the product. So interesting to see what happens inside this particular space. But again, at the same time, as I say, you'd start to move into this particular space. So low risk applications, well, maybe vendors are saying, we support this. There'll be some interesting things happening with application vendors packaging stuff up in containers, I suspect, as well as we go down this particular path. So again, the idea here is in this particular case, you deploy minimal risk database applications and tiers into containers, then see how you go. Always have an exit strategy. So again, that depends on your particular design and those sorts of things, but that's possibly one particular path there. So again, you'll get some improvements in performance, downtime, licensing, become more agile, and again, you enjoy the success of that and make your life easier. And obviously, you can stay on the Windows platform as well. And sure, go for it, absolutely. But possibly, as I said, have a look at what's happening inside this particular space and get some ideas as to how you can better do things inside the Windows platform. So you don't use containers for the right reasons, absolutely, but don't do a lift and shift. So don't just do a lift of a SQL Server instance and put it into a later version of SQL in a VM. I do a lot of this. So, I go into an organization and it's running on SQL Server 2014, let's say, and I can see that they went from sort of SQL Server 7 to 2000 to 2005, then bypassed that and went into 2014. And there's all sorts of problems. Okay, there's performance problems, there's corruption problems, there's, it's a mess. We do some optimization. A 2 terabyte database is now 300 gigabytes in size. It performs better, less licensing of cores required. Backups now don't take 5 hours, they take 30 minutes. So now we can do more in that time that we've gained with doing BI data warehousing workloads or whatever the case might be. So maybe, as I said, you don't go down this particular path, or you will at some particular point in time, but maybe get your shop in order at this point in time so that when you do jump across, you're going to make your life easier as well. And as I said, I see a lot of organizations where things have just organically grown and it's unmanageable, and there's a lot of work to potentially do, but there's also a lot of benefits as well. So if nothing else, as I said, stay on the Windows platform, but do a better job, come up with some standards, SOEs, tiers for running SQL Server, so when you upgrade to the later versions, it's nice and clean, and then go forward with that as well. So getting started, there's a lot of literature. There's a lot of literature out there. I just thought I might put this in because I didn't know what else to put in. So this is just really, really basic stuff. So I think it's more concepts. And as I said, I didn't want to go into the Kubernetes side of things, and other people have done that. So I think let's start off with the fundamentals, so make sure you understand that. So you can see I've got a link to just understanding the concept of Docker, getting started, configuring SQL Server containers. All of the examples are basic. You can do a lot better. So it's not copy-paste. Okay, that's what we've been doing potentially with SQL Server. Do a better job, because I think they're just conceptually giving you ideas of getting up and running in a lab environment, sandbox that you want to play around with. You can do a lot better than what's in the literature there. So that's the important point that I want to address there. Configure SQL Server containers. I think volumes and storage are quite important. So that is a story that should unfold a lot better, because right now we're just spinning up containers and spinning up a volume and putting a claim against it. So I'm not sure if, for production systems, maybe there are better ways of doing that. So again, understand that and research that particular area, and obviously there'll be ties into what vendors are doing. And also understand Docker files, because again, the power of Docker is to customize this so you can deploy rapidly and not have to do manual things, and I need to stop talking. But I won't, because I don't listen. So, thank you very much for staying past. Have we gone way over time or a little? Oh, God. Thank you so much.